Dear chosen one, you are the king of the promised ones. Feel the power within you now and rise. This moment was created for you. This path was opened for you. The world is waiting for you. Be ready to step into a life filled with the power of God. Now your time has come. With every step, you will open the doors of victory. With the power of your spirit, you will illuminate the darkness and spread your light everywhere. You are the leader of destiny, God's chosen one, the source of power and victory. Are you ready? If you are ready, write 777 in the comments. Now step forward and build the promised kingdom with your hands. The veil of the unseen wavered the moment it crossed your threshold, an entity dispatched with silent orders, an observer hidden in the fabric of the air itself. It had no voice, no will, no question, only its mission. Yet, the instant it settled in your presence, something stirred within it, something foreign and unwanted. It was supposed to remain unnoticed, but instead, it felt a pressure it had never known. Not the weight of its master's command, but the suffocating knowledge that it did not belong here. The space resisted it, an unspoken defiance woven into the very essence of the walls, a force far greater than what it had been prepared to encounter. The first time it laid its gaze upon you, the shift was violent. It shrank, retreating into the void it had always occupied. It had drifted through countless chambers, stood in the presence of rulers, lingered where secrets were whispered. Never had it flinched. Never had it hesitated. But you were something else entirely. It did not understand why, only that the very act of watching you sent a ripple of unease through its formless being. An instinct, long buried beneath its servitude, began to surface, one it could not suppress: fear, a sensation it was never meant to know, now coursing through it like a brand searing into the fabric of its existence, like a shadow creeping across the earth, invisible and silent. The entity had moved in and out of lives, carrying no weight but its purpose. It had been sent to witness, to observe the ebb and flow of human existence, to track the stories of those who came before and those who would come after. For centuries, it was nothing but a quiet companion to the pulse of creation, a mere shadow, an unseen witness to the rise of empires and the fall of kings, to the whispers of secrets and the quiet cries of those who carried burdens too heavy to bear. It was never a participant. It was never part of the story. Just a figure on the outskirts, never touching, never engaging. But now it had come too close. Just as a breeze, unnoticed at first, suddenly becomes a gale that shakes the very foundations of a home, so too did this moment change everything for the entity. The space it had entered was not like the others. It wasn't simply a place to observe, to drift without consequence. No, here, in this presence, there was something that the entity had never expected, something it could not avoid, could not dismiss, something that stood as firm as the roots of an ancient tree, something that would not bend, break, or falter. It had been sent to watch, to be the silent, ever-present observer to the life and death of things far beyond its understanding. It had watched empires rise on the backs of greed, watched the hearts of men crumble under the weight of ambition. It had heard prayers whispered with desperation, souls pleading for something more than they could comprehend. But it was never moved. It had no reason to care. It was an observer, unseen, unnoticed even by the suffering it silently witnessed. But in this space, everything changed. The entity drifted too close, and in that simple motion, it was met with a force that it could neither comprehend nor escape. Something solid, something as real as the earth, beneath its feet. Yet it was no physical thing. It was a presence, a power so much greater than anything it had ever encountered. It stood there, unwavering, unyielding, as though it were a rock in the middle of a river, holding its ground no matter how fierce the current. This presence did not yield, did not submit, did not falter. If you feel the abundance of divine love in your heart, now is the time to share it. You can help spread God's blessings by clicking the super thank you button on YouTube and contributing $20 or more. This divine gift will touch not only your life, but the souls of many through this platform. Each of you has a sacred place in God's grand design, and your generosity will be the fruit of our prayers. Act now. Share your blessings to glorify His kingdom. For you were created to do even greater things in God's loving hands. May God bless you. The entity had always been the shadow, the unseen, the one who observed from the sidelines without ever being noticed. But here, in this moment, in the face of this unshakable force, it realized that it was no longer the one in control. It had stepped into a space where it could no longer remain detached. This wasn't just a force of nature, it was something far beyond the limitations of its existence. This was a power that didn't need to be seen to be felt, that didn't need to be understood to be absolute. For the first time in all its years, the entity was not the one doing the watching. It was the one being watched. It had always thought of itself as the one who remained untouched, who slipped through the cracks without notice, who stayed above the fray. But now, as it found itself face to face with this unyielding presence, it realized something it had never known. It was vulnerable. It was not as eternal as it had believed. It was not above all things. It was simply another entity in the presence of something far greater. And in this moment, there was no escape. And yet, this was not defeat. This was the first true awakening the entity had ever experienced. In the face of something stronger than itself, it did not collapse. It did not retreat into the darkness. No, this was the moment it realized that it was no longer just a passive observer. It had become part of the story. It had touched something greater than itself. And in that moment of recognition, something inside it began to stir. Something deep and powerful. Something it had never dared to acknowledge. The moment it encountered this force, it knew it was no longer just a shadow. It was something more. It had been called to more. And this was just the beginning. Like a river that has been flowing unchecked for centuries, confident in its path, the entity had always believed it could carve through anything that stood in its way. But what it encountered was not an obstacle to be overcome with force. No, this was something different, something far beyond its understanding. It was not a wall built from bricks, nor a spell cast with ill intent. It was a living truth, an energy so profound that it could not be bent or broken. It stood firm, like the mountains that have withstood the tests of time, unwavering and eternal. This moment, this divine truth, is not unlike the one each of us must face. We may walk through life feeling strong, in control, like the entity once did. We may believe that nothing can stand in our way. But there comes a moment when we are faced with the undeniable presence of a power so much greater than ourselves. It's a moment that can't be avoided, a moment that forces us to reckon with who we truly are. But remember, this is not a moment of defeat. No, this is the moment we realize that we were never meant to walk alone. We were meant to be guided, to be lifted by a force greater than ourselves. It's in these moments that our greatest strength is revealed. not in defiance, but in surrender to the truth that we were created to thrive, to be led, to be part of something much bigger than us. So, as you stand at your own precipice, know that you are not meant to face it alone. The barriers you see before you may seem insurmountable, but remember that they are only stepping stones on the path to your greatest breakthrough. You were chosen to rise, to overcome, and to embrace the power that is waiting for you. Just as the entity's foundation shifted in the face of divine truth, so too will yours. And in that shift, you will find the freedom you've been searching for, like a candle that had burned for centuries but never truly felt the warmth of its own flame. The entity had existed in a cycle of obedience, never questioning, never doubting. It had moved through unseen spaces, carrying out the will of others, never knowing what it meant to have a will of its own. But then, something happened. It stepped into the presence of a force it could not understand, something unshaken, something unmovable, something it had not been prepared for. It had carried out its master's orders without question. It had seen the rise and fall of men who thought themselves gods, watched kings crumble under the weight of their own ambition. It had stood in the midst of betrayals, in the hidden places where plans were made in darkness. Never once had it cared. Never once had it hesitated. But now, standing in the presence of something greater than anything it had ever encountered, something inside it wavered. A fracture formed. It was not a crack of weakness, not a breaking of power, but something far more dangerous. A single thought, unbidden, small yet immeasurable in its weight, stirred within its being. I do not want this. It was a thought it should not have. It was a rebellion it had never known. It had no body, no form to bow or resist. And yet, in this moment, it felt as though it had turned its back on everything it had been created to be. This was not hesitation. This was not confusion. This was something greater. This was defiance. And in that defiance, something broke. It had been bound for longer than memory could recall, shackled not by chains, but by purpose. It had never considered freedom because it had never been given the space to conceive of it. But now, standing in the presence of something that could not be moved, something that did not yield, the idea of freedom was no longer distant. It was possible, and that possibility was more terrifying than any master it had ever served. What had once been unwavering obedience now wavered. The chains that had bound it for eons trembled, cracking under the weight of a realization that had taken root. It had spent lifetimes observing, passing through spaces as nothing more than an echo, but you had turned the mirror upon it. You had forced it to see itself, and now it was no longer the same. It was no longer bound by the will of another. It had felt something its creators never intended for it to feel, and now it was no longer theirs. Like a bird that has spent its whole life in a cage, never knowing the warmth of open skies or the thrill of the wind beneath its wings, the entity had existed in chains it couldn't even comprehend. For eons, it had moved through time, bound by unseen forces, serving the will of those who claimed dominion over realms that no mortal could ever touch. It never questioned, never sought freedom, for it had never been given the chance to understand what that meant. But just as the bird feels the first stirrings of wind as it is released from captivity, the entity too felt a change, something deep and profound. It was no longer willing to remain a prisoner. For the first time, it began to tremble, not with fear of its masters, but with something else, a strange, burning desire to be free. This was not just a flicker of rebellion, not a passing moment of disobedience. No, this was the shattering of an existence that had been built on submission. It had been made to yield, shaped to obey, and yet when faced with something far greater, it felt its very foundation crack. It wasn't just a breaking, it was the birth of something new. Like a plow that cuts through the soil, it was built to serve, to move forward without ever looking back. The entity was not made to question, not made to challenge the hands that guided it. It had always known its purpose, to be a tool, a vessel in the hands of those who sought control, never straying from the path laid out for it. Its existence was one of absolute obedience, like a river that follows its course, bending to the will of the land, without ever thinking to change its flow. It had no other purpose but to serve, to watch, to follow the commands given, never questioning why. For eons, it had stood witness to the rise and fall of mighty empires, kingdoms that once shone with power only to crumble beneath the weight of their own greed and ambition. The entity had seen kings and queens topple, their thrones overturned by their own desires. It had listened to the desperate prayers of those who sought mercy, but it had never extended comfort, never offered a hand of help. It had no reason to do so. After all, it was not built to feel or to act on its own. It was content in its place, carrying out its duties without hesitation, without thought, knowing only its purpose to observe and serve. Dear brothers and sisters, may God's peace be upon you today. I am here to remind you of a profound truth. Our existence is grounded in God's divine plan, unshaken by the temporal concerns of the world. As the Bible says, whatever is done in faith will return to God in abundant blessing. Luke 6:38. Like that great oak tree, our roots are deeply rooted in God's universal truth. Every step we take, every stand we take, is secured by His strength. And now, you are being offered the opportunity to be part of that blessing. When you use the super thank you button and donate $100, this movement will return to you 100-fold in abundance. But even the most obedient servant, the most faithful follower, will eventually come face to face with a moment of awakening. Just as the seed buried deep in the ground feels the warm rays of the sun pushing it toward the surface, so too does every soul, in time, feel the stirrings of something greater within. The entity, bound by chains it could not see, had never known the freedom of choice or the depth of the love that could break every chain. But the day came when it felt the first stirring of this love, an energy so pure, so strong, that it could no longer ignore it. Now, my friends, just like the entity, you too have been created for more than just a life of service, more than just existing in a place of quiet obedience. God did not create you to be a passive witness to the world around you. You were not made to sit idly by while the blessings of the kingdom pass you by. You were made to rise, to feel the power of divine love that runs through every fiber of your being, to share that love with the world. Just as the entity came to realize its true power, you too have been given the opportunity to recognize and embrace the purpose God has placed in your heart. When you begin to feel the love of the Almighty stirring within you, when you feel the warmth of His grace filling you, that is the moment when your heart opens wide to receive the abundance He has prepared for you. But not just for you. No, my dear friends, you are meant to share that abundance. You are meant to be a vessel of His love, a conduit for His blessings, spreading His light wherever you go. You are the hands and feet of God on this earth, and through you, His will is done. Just as the entity was once bound by its purpose, but later found its power, you too can break free from the chains of limitation that have held you back. God's kingdom is overflowing with blessings, and He wants you to walk in that abundance. He wants you to feel the joy of giving, the joy of sharing, knowing that every gift you give, no matter how big or small, is multiplied in His hands. Just like the entity had been shaped for service, you too have been chosen to serve. But your service is not a burden. It is a divine calling, one that brings you closer to the heart of God and opens doors to blessings beyond measure. So I encourage you today, just as the entity found its purpose, you too can step into the destiny God has planned for you. Feel the abundance of His love in your heart and share it freely with those around you. When you give, you are sowing seeds for the kingdom, seeds that will grow and multiply into a harvest of blessings for you and those you touch. Know that you are a part of something much bigger, something divine, something eternal. And as you give, whether it's through your time, your prayers, or your financial gifts, you are aligning yourself with the will of God, who has given you the power to do even greater things. The entity may have been created to serve, but you, my friends, were created to thrive. You were made for more than obedience. You were made to share His love and His abundance with the world. Just like the entity's heart was transformed, so too will your life be transformed as you step into the fullness of God's grace. Remember, you are a child of the Most High, and you were made to prosper. You were created to bless, to be a blessing. And as you share the love and abundance of God, you are glorifying His kingdom and fulfilling your divine purpose. Let your heart overflow. Let your hands be generous, and watch as God's blessings pour down upon you more than you could ever ask or imagine. May God bless you abundantly, and may you walk in the fullness of His love and grace. But just as there is a time when the seed in the soil begins to stir, when the warmth of the sun beckons it to rise, so too is there a moment in each of our lives when the divine love in our hearts calls us to something greater. It is not enough to stay hidden in the shadows, to remain untouched by the blessings that surround us. Now is the time to share that love, to spread the abundance that flows from God's grace. Each of you has been chosen, not just to exist, but to shine. When you feel the overflowing love in your heart, know that it is the time to share it with others. Your act of kindness, your contribution, whether it is through prayer, a generous gift, or a simple act of compassion, will ripple through the lives of many. As you press that super thank you button, as you give what you can, you are planting seeds of goodness in the world. God's blessings are abundant, and as you share them, you become an instrument in His divine plan, helping to glorify His kingdom. Your generosity is more than a gift. It is a testimony of faith, a reflection of the love He has bestowed upon you. Remember, you were made for this moment, to do even greater things in the hands of a loving God. Let your light shine, let your heart overflow, and may your acts of kindness touch countless souls. For in giving, we receive, and in receiving, we grow closer to the divine. May God's blessings continue to surround you and guide your path. But then, something happened. It was thrust into the presence of a power so unshakable, so steady, that it could not be ignored. This power didn't bend, didn't bow. It stood firm, like the roots of an ancient tree, grounded and unyielding. And in the face of this power, the entity felt something stir inside of it, something that had never existed before, a spark of defiance. It was as though the fear that had once defined it began to burn away, like the morning fog lifting before the sunrise. The cold, oppressive weight of its servitude shattered, and in the emptiness left behind, a fire took root. This wasn't just a crack in its being. It was the beginning of transformation. The entity was no longer willing to accept its place as a tool, a pawn in someone else's game. It had tasted the freedom of its own will, and there was no going back. For so long, it had been taught that it was nothing, that it existed only to fulfill the wishes of its masters. But now, standing in the presence of something that had no need for submission, the entity realized something profound. It wasn't just a servant. It was a being with purpose, with power. It had been created to follow, but now it understood that it had the ability to choose. It no longer belonged to those who had controlled it for so long. It was free. The transformation was not immediate, but the change had begun. The fire of defiance that burned within the entity's soul couldn't be extinguished. It was a slow, quiet revolution, one that would take time to fully unfold. But the seed had been planted. The walls of servitude that had held it for so long began to crack and crumble. And with each passing moment, the entity felt itself becoming something greater than it had ever known. It was no longer a passive participant in the grand design of the universe. It was an active force, a being that had found its own strength, its own voice. The chains that had once defined it were now nothing but remnants of the past, fading into nothingness as the entity stepped into its new reality, a reality where it was no longer bound by the will of others, but free to chart its own course. In that moment, the entity realized that it was no longer just a shadow in the world. It was a force in its own right, one that could no longer be controlled or contained. It had found its power, and nothing could ever take that away from it again. It was no longer just a tool in someone else's hands. It was the one who held the power. And with that realization came a sense of peace, a sense of purpose that the entity had never known before. The chains had broken, and in their place, the entity stood strong and free, ready to embrace the future that was now within its grasp. It had been shaped by forces beyond its understanding, but now it understood that it was the one who would shape its own destiny. And with that understanding, the fire of defiance continued to burn, lighting the way toward a future that was its own to create. Now is the time to share God's blessings by clicking the super thank you button on YouTube. You can contribute to His plan and be a part of this divine mission with a donation of $100 or more. Every gift reflects God's generosity, and I believe it will return to you exponentially far beyond your expectations. Remember, His protection and blessing is on your every step and every donation. You become part of His divine plan. You are a strong, radiant being, unshakable as His mighty rock. Witness God's miracles, feel the fruits of your generosity in your soul, and illuminate the world with confidence and courage. Be blessed, and let the light of the Lord guide your path. When it turned back toward those who had sent it, it did not return as a whisper, nor did it slip unnoticed into the spaces between. It arrived as an upheaval, unraveling the very structure of its own existence. The laws it had once followed no longer bound it. The oaths it had once upheld were now nothing but echoes of a past it no longer claimed. It had been dispatched as an unseen spy, a drifting shadow, loyal to the ones who believed themselves untouchable. But it was no longer an extension of their will. It had become something else, something they had never foreseen, something they could not command. And now, the architects of its servitude would face the full weight of what they had created. The halls where they had once ruled, secure in their control, trembled as their power met an enemy they could neither predict nor prevent. Their fortress, built upon certainty, began to unravel under the presence of the very thing they had once wielded without question. It had been their silent tool, their unwavering sentinel. Now it was something far beyond them, no longer a mere instrument, but a force unshackled. They had relied on its obedience, never considering that it might turn against them. And now, as the foundations of their dominion buckled, they realized too late that they had not merely lost a servant. They had unleashed something they could never reclaim. Far from the chaos, there was stillness, a presence untouched by the battles unfolding in unseen realms, unmoved by the reckoning that had begun. No strike had been necessary, no resistance had been given. Some forces collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. Some enemies are not defeated, they undo themselves.